I wasn't in a good place that September, and I knew it in the plain way a man knows when his own boots are wearing crooked. My name is Wayne Preston. I was 48, left-handed by necessity after a rotator cuff tear in my right shoulder, and sitting on unpaid leave from Bailey truck and diesel with a sling that smelled faintly of medicated rub and old sweat. I had moved back up to my mother's place on the ridge outside Blackwater Hollow because the house I rented in town had turned mean with quiet. Her chair was gone, her canning jars were boxed, but the air still held her shape, and every room answered me with what wasn't there. The homestead had never been much to look at if you were grading by square footage or paint condition. 2-bedroom farmhouse with a porch that leaned a little east, storm windows that rattled when a hard front moved through. A hand pump long retired beside the back steps, but it sat where the pines thinned into pasture, and the pasture dropped toward a creek that ran clear when weather was kind. My mother had called it good enough land, and she said that with the same reverence some people reserve for a chapel. She had sung while she worked. Not performative singing, not something for guests. Just old hymns breathed into chores like they were part of the work itself. I hadn't understood that until she was gone, and the place fell silent in a way that made my chest hurt. By the second week of September, I had settled into a routine strict enough to keep my mind from wandering too far. I woke before first light, because sleep never held me past 4 anyway. I fed Rufus, my hound mix, who had one torn ear and the patient eyes of a creature that had decided to stick with me despite my moods. I checked the woodpile, split what I could one-handed with a short maul, and a stump brace I'd rigged from scrap. I patched low fence where the lower pasture met the brush line. I washed what needed washing in my mother's old wringer machine, swearing softly at every crank turn because wet cloth is heavier than memory tells you. Then, I pinned sheets to the line facing the pines, same as she did, corners squared, clothespins matched by colour if I could find pairs. That laundry line was where grief sat down beside me and wouldn't move. It stretched from a cedar post by the porch to a hickory near the garden fence, and I could still see her there in my mind in a faded blue house dress, singing softly and tenderly, like she was just speaking to somebody in the next room. I forced myself to keep that ritual, because not doing it felt like abandoning her twice. Every pin I clipped with my left hand and braced right arm felt clumsy, slow, and personal. I would stand there with damp sheets slapping my jeans in the wind and think, this is a dumb way to break your own heart every day, and then I'd keep clipping anyway. Grief is stubborn labor. So is love when it has nowhere to go. Blackwater weather rolled in early that year. Folks around here called it that when a cold storm front came down hard off the uplands, stacked rain over rain, and turned every crossing into a problem. Creeks rose without much warning. Driveways rutted out. Mud sucked at tires and boots like it had a grudge. The kind of weather that takes simple chores and makes them into full-day jobs. The first long band of it came on a Tuesday afternoon. Low clouds stacked like wet wool over the ridge, and by dark the tin roof was hammering steady. I sat at the kitchen table with one lamp on, bills spread in front of me, doing arithmetic with a pencil nub, and a jaw clenched so tight I woke sore the next morning. 3 days passed under that weather pattern, and I got meaner inside my own head with each one. The shoulder throbbed in damp air. Workman's comp paperwork sat unresolved. I had enough savings for a while, but a while has edges when you're paying for physical therapy and fuel and a house that keeps needing one more thing. On the 4th day, I drove down to Morrow's feed for dog chow and salt blocks, mostly because I needed to hear another human voice and prove I hadn't turned into one of those men folks whisper about. Gary Morrow was behind the counter, tallying invoices with reading glasses halfway down his nose. "You're up the Preston place now, right?" he said, sliding the sack across the wood. "How's that shoulder coming?" "Slow," I said. "Doctor says 6 more weeks before full duty. Might be less if I quit pretending I'm still 25. He gave me that practical half smile. "You ain't fooling nobody but yourself. Storm's turning mean again tonight. You got your wood dry?" "Mostly. Tarp keeps coming loose." Gary nodded toward the window where the sky had gone iron grey. "Tie it lower and double knot. Blackwater will test every lazy decision a man makes." That sounds like advice for more than tarps. He snorted once, friendly, but not soft. "Ain't that the truth?" I carried the feed out one-handed and stood a minute in the lot before loading it, listening to the far rumble over the ridge. There was comfort in that exchange, small as it was. Men like Gary didn't ask for your feelings and didn't offer theirs, but they kept track of who was hurting and who needed an extra 10 minutes by the counter. That kind of care has its own dialect. At home, my evenings narrowed into familiar motions. Door latched against wind. Stove checked. Sling off, then back on. Pain pill with a glass of tap water that always tasted faintly of limestone. Rufus thumping his tail against the floorboards while I heated beans or fried potatoes in cast iron. I kept the radio low, mostly old country and farm reports, enough sound to break the silence without filling it. The preacher from Cedar Forks still ran a Sunday night hour, and once I heard the opening bars of In the Garden and had to turn it off because I wasn't prepared for how fast tears can rise in a grown man with calloused hands and a toolbox for a living. I did what practical people do when sorrow won't listen. I measured things. Fence posts replaced, 6. Loads of split wood stacked, 8. Physical therapy bands completed, 3 sets, morning and night. Sheets washed this week, 2. Sleep longer than 4 hours, 0. I told myself if I could reduce life to tasks, then pain would behave like a machine problem. Diagnose it, order parts, reassemble. But grief is not a fuel system, and loneliness is not a belt you can tension correctly and forget. They move under everything. They hum in the walls after dark. One evening, with rain held off for an hour and a weak strip of sunset catching the wet leaves copper and gold, I carried a basket of laundry to the line and paused halfway across the yard, because the whole place smelled like my childhood at once. Wet cotton, soap, cedar pitch, and cold earth. I stood there longer than I meant to, basket hooked awkwardly on my left hip, right shoulder hot and useless, and I could hear her voice in memory, plain as daylight, not spooky, not mystical, just precise. She always started low and then let the note rise when she reached the word, come. I tried it under my breath without deciding to. My voice cracked on the second line. Rufus looked up from the porch with one ear cocked, and if a dog could look sympathetic, he did. "Don't start," I said to him, wiping my nose with my sleeve and giving a laugh that sounded rough even to me. "You hear me sing, you'll run off to another county." He came down the steps anyway and leaned his weight into my left leg while I pinned the first sheet. That dog had no concept of personal space and no regard for dignity, which might be why he kept me human. The ridge itself changed character with weather. On clear mornings it was open and practical, every task visible from the porch. On Blackwater days it turned inward. Fog pooled in the drawers. Sound travelled strange, close then far. The pines along the north edge swayed high while the yard below sat almost still, like different skies were passing over different worlds. I started noticing those details because there wasn't much else to do after dark but watch and listen. A branch tapping the kitchen window could hold my attention 10 full minutes. Water running in the gutters became a rhythm section. Rufus's breathing at my feet became proof I wasn't alone, even when it felt like I was. Toward month's end, my sister Lila called from Owensboro and asked if I'd thought any more about selling the place. Her voice was gentle but practical, same as mine when I'm trying to keep emotion from spilling over. "You don't have to decide now," she said. "I just worry you're up there by yourself too much. Mama wouldn't want you buried alive in chores." "I know," I said, "but I'm not buried. I'm healing up, that's all." "You sound tired, Wayne." "I am tired. That doesn't mean I'm wrong to be here." There was a pause long enough for us both to hear what sat behind those words. "I miss her too," she said finally. "I know you do. You eating right?" "Rufus is, so by extension, yes." She laughed, then got quiet again. "Call me if the creek jumps. Promise." "I promise." After we hung up, I stood on the porch and watched the last light flatten against the ridge, and for the first time in weeks, I admitted something plain. I hadn't come here just to recover my shoulder. I had come because this was the only place where my grief made sense in full scale. Town compressed it into awkward pauses and polite condolences. Up here, sorrow had room to breathe. So did memory. So did whatever part of me still believed work could be a form of prayer, even when the words were gone. That night, the weather radio clicked alive with another advisory, and I set an extra bucket under the back eave, where it always leaked first. I pulled the tarp tighter over the wood and checked the clothesline clips, gathering the ones that had shaken loose into a coffee can by the steps. Rufus paced once around the yard, then settled on the porch mat with his chin on his paws, watching the tree line as if waiting for something I couldn't name. I sat beside him in the porch rocker my mother used, shoulder aching, hands rough from soap and wet rope, and listened to the first drops strike the tin roof, in patient, even taps. I wasn't fixed. I wasn't hopeful in any dramatic sense. But I was still here, and for that evening, still here felt like enough. I stayed in that rocker until the rain quit sounding polite and started sounding determined. The tin roof took the brunt of it. Water spilled off the porch edge in straight silver ropes, and the yard blurred to a dark shine where the clay gave up and turned slick. Rufus lifted his head each time thunder rolled, but never left his mat. I reached down with my left hand and rubbed the rough patch behind his ear, feeling the steady warmth of him under my palm, and tried to breathe with the rhythm of the storm instead of against it. It had been months since I'd cried where anyone could see me, and there was nobody to see me now. But that old instinct to keep my face set still lived in me like muscle memory. I sat there with my jaw tight and my throat burning, and watched rain erase the fence line one post at a time. When the temperature dropped another notch and wind pushed mist under the porch roof, I stood up slow, shoulder protesting, and said, "Come on, partner, we're not proving anything out here." Rufus rose with a sigh that sounded older than either of us, and followed me inside. I latched the door, set a towel by the stove for his paws, and listened to him circle twice on the braided rug before flopping down. The kitchen clock ticked loud in weather like that. Every small sound did. The drip in the back eave bucket, the stovepipe settling, the little click from the refrigerator relay. I made tea in my mother's chipped enamel pot, because coffee at night made my heart race. Then sat at the table with both hands around the mug and looked at the dark window over the sink like it might answer something if I stared hard enough. What settled on me then wasn't dramatic. It was heavier than drama and quieter. Just the plain fatigue of being a grown man with a hurt shoulder, uncertain work, and a house full of echoes that didn't belong to anyone breathing. I ran numbers in my head again because that had become a habit I couldn't shut off. Savings, fuel, pills, physical therapy, feed, utilities. The arithmetic never turned cruel, but it never turned kind either. Right in the middle of that loop, I caught myself looking toward the hallway where my mother's room used to be, and waiting, for one stupid half-second, to hear her clear her throat before she started a hymn. Habit can outlive reason by years. I laughed once through my nose, the way men do when they're trying not to break in two over something that small. I slept in fragments. Stormlight flashed through the curtains and made the ceiling beams jump. Each time I drifted off, some new gust rattled the windows and hauled me back up. Around 3, I gave up and sat on the couch with a blanket over my legs, Rufus's head on my boot, and the weather radio murmuring county names. I thought about driving back to town when my shoulder healed, going straight from the clinic to the rental house, back to work orders and injector pumps and ordinary noise. It should have sounded like relief. Instead, it felt like standing at a crossroads where both roads led to work and neither one led to rest. I wasn't looking for signs. I was looking for one day that didn't feel like endurance. By first light, the worst of it had moved east, leaving the ridge washed clean and raw. The world after heavy rain always looked recently made, as if somebody had taken a damp cloth to every leaf and board and stone, while the rest of us slept poorly. I pulled on boots, checked the creek from the upper field with binoculars, and saw brown water running fast, but still below the bank cut. Good enough for now. The wood tarp had slipped on one side, so I retied it lower like Gary suggested, bracing rope with my knee while my left hand worked the knot. My right shoulder burned in a narrow line from neck to arm by the time I was done. I fed Rufus, swallowed my anti-inflammatory with a mouthful of cold biscuit, and told myself I'd do one load of wash and call it a victory. The wringer machine complained all morning in a language of squeaks and stubborn gears. I kept to flat things first, sheets, pillowcases, because fitted corners with one good arm were a private form of punishment. By the time I carried the basket to the line, sunlight had broken through in angled strips that turned steam off the grass into low, silver smoke. I shook out the first sheet and pinned the top edge, then stood there a moment with the cloth ballooning and snapping gentle against my chest. No traffic noise reached up from the hollow. No chainsaw, no tractor, no barking from the Lawson place 2 ridges over. Just wind high in the pines, and the soft clink of wooden clothespins in the coffee can at my feet. I started humming without noticing, low and rough, softly and tenderly, the tune more than the words. Halfway down the line, that ache in my chest returned, sudden and deep as a bruise pressed wrong. I leaned my forearm against the cedar post and closed my eyes. I could picture her hands, quick and sure, taking 2 corners of a sheet and snapping it once to square it before pinning. I could picture the way she'd tilt her head toward the tree line on the long notes, like she was singing to the ridge itself and expected it to answer. My voice quit on me. I took one breath, then another, and said, out loud, to nobody visible, "I'm trying, Mama. I'm still trying." Saying it made me feel foolish and steadier at the same time. Rufus trotted the yard while I finished, nose down in wet clover, then stopped near the north edge where the pasture met brush. He didn't bark. Rufus barked at deer, squirrels, delivery trucks, and once at a wheelbarrow I'd left on its side like it offended him personally. But now, he just sat, chest tall, tail tapping the ground in a slow, content beat, eyes fixed on the pines as if somebody he trusted had stepped just out of my sight. I wiped my hands on my jeans and watched him watch the trees. "You seeing rabbits?" I asked. "Or are you just being mysterious because you know I'm sleep-deprived?" He glanced back at me, gave one soft huff, then returned his attention to the same spot, like I'd interrupted a conversation. That evening came clear and cool, the kind of post-storm dusk where every color deepens before dark. I fried potatoes with onions, ate standing at the counter, and carried my plate to the porch when the light turned honey gold through the sycamores. Rufus curled at my boots. The ridge settled. Then, all at once, it held still in a way I hadn't felt before. Chickadees that had been bickering in the cedar fell silent together, not gradually, just a clean hush laid over the yard. Even the insects seemed to lower their volume. The stillness didn't prick my skin like danger. It felt attentive. That's the best word I have for it. Attentive, like the woods had paused to listen. I waited for the uneasy part to arrive, and it didn't. No surge of alarm in my gut. No raised hackles on Rufus. He rose, stretched, and padded down the steps toward the tree line with the easy confidence he used when approaching neighbors he liked. I followed as far as the garden fence favoring my shoulder. The pines at the edge were dark with the evening, trunks standing close as fence posts. I saw no shape, no movement I could swear to. Just that same deep quiet and a faint smell that rode the cooling air. Cedar, wet earth, and something warm and animal that was not unpleasant. Rufus sat again, tail thumping, then gave a little whine that sounded like greeting. I felt my own pulse in my throat, not from fear, more from the strain of trying to understand what my senses were telling me. "Okay," I said, keeping my voice low because whispering seemed natural there. "If somebody's out there, you can stay out there. We're doing fine at this distance." I heard myself and almost laughed. There I was, setting polite boundaries with a stand of trees. If loneliness had a report card, mine would have had comments in red ink. But the humour took the edge off, and I stood there another minute until a regular breeze came through, and the chickadees resumed their squabbling like somebody lifted a hand signal. I didn't sleep much better that night, but not for the same reason. My mind kept revisiting Rufus's posture, that calm certainty in him. Dogs know weather and temperament in ways people pretend not to admire. He had not acted confused, he had acted reassured. By dawn, I had almost convinced myself I'd projected the whole thing, because grief can colour ordinary moments and turn them significant when they're not. I opened the front door with coffee in hand, ready to start proving myself wrong in practical steps. 2 smooth river stones sat crossed on the top porch step, balanced so neatly they made an X. Beside them lay a barred feather, dry despite the night damp, angled as carefully as if someone had set a table place. I looked first for human tracks in the softened mud around the steps. There were mine from last evening, Rufus's prints over mine, and rain-dimpled ground. Nothing else clear going in or out. I crouched slow, shoulder-barking, and studied the stones. They were creek-worn, grey-blue, each about the length of my palm. Not from my gravel drive, not from the porch border, brought from somewhere. Rufus came to stand beside me, nose twitching, and sat without touching them. No growl, no tension. Just that same quiet interest, tail making one steady thump against the boards. I reached out and lifted the feather first. It was cool, light, and intact, not dropped in a scramble, deliberately placed. I set it back where I found it and looked out over the yard to the pines, sun just catching their upper limbs, while the lower trunks stayed in shadow. A practical man looks for practical causes. Neighbor kid, prank, wind coincidence. I ran each explanation and none of them seated clean. By the 3rd afternoon after that storm, I had started checking the porch before coffee like a man checking gauges before turning a key. And each time I did, I felt that same calm question rise in me. If something was near this house, why did every living thing around me seem easier in its presence, not alarmed? I stood there on the porch with coffee cooling in my hand and that question hanging in me like a hook, and for once, I didn't rush to yank it out. I carried the stones and feather inside only long enough to wipe the damp off the step, then set them back exactly where I found them, because moving them felt like interrupting somebody speaking quietly. Rufus watched me do it, head tilted, then went down the steps and made his usual morning loop around the yard, nose low, tail easy. He paused at the tree line again, sat, and looked into the pines like he was waiting for a late friend to catch up. I tried to get practical. I always did. I checked the mud by the drive where a truck would have left tracks. Nothing fresh. I walked the porch perimeter looking for kids' shoe prints, prank evidence, cigarette butts, anything. Just rain-soft clay, my own boot marks, and Rufus's paws layered over them like signatures. I even held one of the stones up to the light and turned it in my hand as if geology might solve this for me. Smooth creek stone, fine grain, pale grey with a charcoal seam. Not decorative, not special to anybody but me, right then. Inside, I set my mug down and found myself smiling for the first time in weeks, which made me suspicious of myself. Grief had become the weather inside my chest, steady and low pressure. That morning, for a few minutes, curiosity moved in front of it. Not joy, not relief, just interest. A small spark of wanting to know. It felt almost disloyal, like laughing too loud at a funeral meal. And then it felt human again. By noon, the sky had opened into one of those clean September blues that look scrubbed with steel wool. I ran the ringer, fed Rufus, and carried an armload of split oak toward the porch rack. That was when I saw the kindling stack by the back steps. Somebody had laid pencil-thin twigs in one row, finger-thick splits in another, and short cedar slats on top, all squared by length like a display in a hardware aisle. I hadn't done that. My kindling method was pile it and trust future Wayne to sort it out. This was careful, patient. Rain had passed less than a day before, and every piece was dry as if it had been sheltered first. I stood there with my own untidy armload and said, "Well, that's just showing off." Rufus came over, sniffed the stacked wood, then looked up the hill and sat. Tail thump. No bark. I carried my wood in and went through the ordinary explanations one by one. Gary from Morrow's? He wouldn't drive up unannounced and play wood elf behind my house. Lila. She lived too far and would have called first. Neighbor kid? Maybe, except no tracks, no tire marks, and no sign of somebody cutting across fence. I told myself, a man under stress can miss his own handiwork, can do work half automatic, and forget he did it. Then I looked at my shoulder brace and laughed once. I couldn't have split those cedar slats one-handed without cussing loud enough to wake county lines. Theory failed. That afternoon I drove down for feed anyway, partly to keep a normal schedule and partly to hear my own voice around other people. Gary was tallying seed orders again, radio low behind him. "You look less haunted today," he said, handing me a receipt. "Either the shoulder quit hurting, or you slept." "Neither," I said. "You been up my way?" He squinted over his glasses. "Not since last week. Why?" "Found kindling stacked by my back steps. Real tidy. Thought maybe you sent a church volunteer with a compulsion problem." He barked a laugh. "Buddy, if I had volunteers that ambitious, I'd put them on my books. You check for bear? Bear that sorts by diameter? Could be a union bear." I shook my head and he softened. "You doing okay up there, Wayne?" "I'm functioning," I said, which was true enough. On the way home, I caught myself replaying that exchange and feeling embarrassed by how much it mattered that Gary took me seriously for 10 seconds. Out on the ridge, you can start doubting your own observations faster than you admit. A practical life gives you habits of proof. Torque specs, fuel pressure, measured gaps. This thing had no gauge for it, and still it sat there in plain sight. Stones crossed, feather placed, kindling sorted. I kept trying to drag it back into familiar logic, and each attempt came up short by the same narrow margin. 3 mornings later, after another wet night, I found the rusted snare by the lower fence where the pasture pinched toward the creek path. I hadn't set traps in years, not since my mother asked me to stop because she hated hearing distressed animals, and I didn't need the meat. This one had likely been old, maybe left by somebody crossing through last season. The loop was sprung open, cable twisted straight, anchor stake pulled and laid beside it, like a tool returned to a drawer. No fur caught in the wire, no drag marks, just a trap made harmless and set where it could be seen. I crouched down and touched the cable. Fresh bend in the steel, recent force, strong hands, careful finish. "Thank you," I said to nobody I could see, and then felt ridiculous and did not take it back. The next sign undid me in a quieter way. It was late afternoon, light turning amber through the kitchen window, when I came in from rehanging a gate and found a cluster of goldenrod laid across my mother's old enamel hymnal on the porch table. Not tossed, arranged with stems aligned, blooms facing out, like somebody knew what object mattered and treated it with respect. That hymnal had a chipped corner, and her name written inside in blue fountain pen ink. I hadn't touched it since the funeral week. I sat down in her rocker and just looked at the flowers for a long time. I could hear bees working the asters by the fence, a tractor faint 2 ridges over, Rufus drinking from his pan. The world kept its normal sounds, but my chest loosened in a way I hadn't felt since spring. I put my left hand on the hymnal cover and thought, I told myself this couldn't be real. And yet, here it was, real in the same way any chore is real. Physical, specific, completed by someone with intent. Whatever was near my house understood gentleness as a choice. By the first week of October, checking the porch became as automatic as checking the weather radio. Some mornings there was nothing new, and I almost felt disappointed, which I did not enjoy admitting. Some mornings there'd be a small arrangement, 3 hickory nuts set in a line on the rail, a clean strip of bark braided through the slats, once a clothespin I'd lost wedged upright in a crack where I'd never have looked. None of it flashy, all of it deliberate. My grief didn't leave. It changed shape around these moments, made room for attention. I started speaking out loud while I worked, not because I expected answers, just because silence no longer felt empty. "Line's full today," I'd mutter while shaking out sheets. "Storm's due Thursday, so we're racing weather again." Rufus would patrol, then sit facing the trees as if supervising an invisible crew. One morning he carried an apple from somewhere and set it on the porch mat without chewing it. We didn't have apple trees. I left it on the rail and found only the stem by dusk. Late that same day, clouds built over the far ridge, but held their rain. I took a bucket and walked the lower pasture fence, checking staples where the last storm had loosened wire. The light had that slanting, honey-thin quality that makes every weed head glow. Rufus trotted ahead, stopping now and then to sniff vole holes, then circling back to make sure I was still moving. The sycamore by the creek crossing had dropped half its leaves, big pale hands of them plastered to the mud. I was bent over a fence post, trying to lever a staple with pliers using mostly left arm and stubbornness, when Rufus gave a short huff and moved forward with sudden purpose. He didn't bolt, he didn't stiffen. He trotted toward the fallen sycamore at the pasture edge, tail level, ears up, like he'd spotted somebody arriving for supper. I straightened slow and followed, boots sinking a little in the wet ground. 50 yards out, where saplings grew thick between the old tree and the pines, I saw movement that didn't match wind. A dark mass shifting sideways through brush, high enough that young trunks reached only to mid-thigh. It stepped with a control I have only seen in men carrying newborn calves, placing each foot, testing ground, moving branches aside instead of pushing through. I froze with my hand on the fence post and watched the shape pass behind a clump of sumac, then emerge again in clearer light. Big, bigger than any black bear standing, bigger than the porch roofline in my mind's comparison, broad shoulders tapering to long arms furred dark brown, near black with rust highlights where sun touched it. It turned slightly, and I caught the profile of a face set forward and calm. Not bared teeth, not charge posture, just attention. One massive hand lifted a sapling with 2 fingers, and thumb saw a low nest woven in grass at its base, stayed undisturbed. Then it set the sapling back exactly where it had been. My body did 2 opposite things at once. Adrenaline hit like a hammer, and a deep certainty settled under it. I wasn't in danger. I wanted to run, and I wanted to stay, both true in the same breath. The creature looked toward Rufus first. Rufus sat down, tail thump slow as a metronome. Then those amber-brown eyes shifted to me and held, steady as old wood. I backed 1 step toward the fence without taking my gaze off it and heard myself say, polite as church foyer small talk, "Excuse me." The creature blinked once. I took another careful step back, then another, until my calves touched the wire and I could brace. No rush from it, no bluff. It angled its body to give me space and moved along the tree line, not away in panic, not toward me, just parallel like we were 2 men using the same narrow aisle and minding each other's room. Branches brushed its shoulders and sprang back. A warm scent drifted across the field, cedar, damp fir, clean earth after rain. It paused once beside a young pine where 2 chickadees hopped and kept hopping. Unbothered, then continued into denser shadow until only motion remained, then nothing at all. I stayed at that fence post long enough for my legs to quit shaking. Rufus trotted back and leaned against my left shin, looking up with a face that seemed almost smug. "You knew," I said. "You absolutely knew, and you let me look foolish for days." He sneezed and wagged, which I took as confirmation. Walking back to the house, I laughed once, breathless and shaky and half incredulous. I was a diesel mechanic with an ice pack waiting in my freezer and overdue paperwork on the table, and I had just said excuse me to a giant wild man in my own lower pasture like we were passing in a grocery aisle. It would have been funny if my hands weren't trembling so hard I spilled half the bucket before I reached the porch. I set the bucket down, sat in my mother's rocker, and looked out at the pines while dusk came in layer by layer. My shoulder hurt, my jeans were muddy. The world had not turned magical. The creek still needed watching, the fence still needed staples, and I still had to figure out work when my leave ran out. But a crack had opened in the hard shell I'd built around my life, and wonder moved through it, clean and quiet. I didn't have a story I could tell anybody yet without sounding unwell. I had a field, a dog, a set of tracks I hadn't gone back to measure, and the memory of deliberate gentleness in something built on a scale my mind had no shelf for. I sat there until the first stars showed, humming under my breath without deciding to. And for the first time since I came up that ridge, the song didn't break in the middle. I stayed in that rocker until the stars multiplied enough to turn the sky grainy. And I kept humming because stopping felt like closing a door I had just found. Rufus slept with his chin on my boot, one paw twitching now and then in dream runs, and the ridge settled into its night order. Tree frogs down by the creek, a barred owl farther off, wind moving high needles in long, patient brushes. Then, from the north edge of the yard, I heard 2 careful steps in wet leaves, and the faint click of a branch being set down instead of snapped. I looked up. Between the pines, where moonlight silvered trunks and left the ground dark, a broad shape stood still enough to disappear unless I held my eyes exactly right. My chest tightened, but not in panic. It was the strain of meeting something that did not fit any category I trusted, and noticing, all at once, that it was giving me room on purpose. I didn't stand. I didn't call out. I rested both hands on the rocker arms and kept breathing slow through my nose, the way physical therapy taught me when the shoulder flared. The figure shifted its weight once, and even that movement was considerate, like a man easing a floorboard so it wouldn't creak in a sleeping house. Rufus raised his head, saw the tree line, and thumped his tail twice against the porch boards before laying his muzzle back down. That did more for me than any sermon I've ever heard. I watched the silhouette for another minute, maybe two, while my mind threw up explanations and knocked them down just as fast. Bear shape was wrong. Height was wrong. Posture was wrong. More than that, the feeling was wrong for danger. Attention, again. Watchful, yes. Threatening, no. I tipped my chin toward the trees. A small nod I would have given any neighbor across a fence, and the figure dipped its head in return before stepping backward into shadow. Inside, I switched on the kitchen light and leaned both palms on the counter until the tremor left my left hand. Then I did the mechanic thing and made a record. I tore a page from an old invoice pad and wrote down time, weather, distance, position, what Rufus did, what I smelled, what I heard. Not because I planned to publish a field report. I needed to keep my own mind honest. If grief was coloring things, notes would expose it. If something was truly happening, notes would hold shape better than memory. I set the page under a magnet on the fridge, drank a glass of water, and laughed once when I caught my reflection in the window. "Wayne," I said softly, "you are documenting porch manners with a giant forest resident like it's a maintenance log." The laugh helped, so did the truth sitting under it. By the 5th morning of October, a pattern had settled in, whether I believed in it or not. I'd open the porch door before coffee and look first at the step, then the rail, then the little table where Mama's hymnal sat. Some mornings there'd be nothing, and I'd feel oddly relieved and oddly disappointed at the same time. Some mornings there'd be one small sign, 3 dry cedar cones in a row after rain, a clean strip of bark looped through the porch spindle. 2 clothespins I'd lost days apart set side by side as if someone had been paying better attention than me. I started replying in kind without announcing it to myself. I'd leave an apple on the lower step. I'd set out a pinch of coarse salt in a saucer by the post. Once, feeling foolish and sincere in equal measure, I laid a sprig of mint beside the crossed stones and said, "For the record, that's all I've got growing that's worth sharing." Over the next 4 evenings, the distance between us closed by inches and by consent. I would hang wash in late light, shoulder aching by the 3rd sheet, humming low so my breathing stayed steady, and I would catch a glimpse of dark movement beyond the fence, where the pines opened. Never rushing, never crowding. Sometimes I'd only hear the soft footfalls and that warm cedar animal scent drifting on damp air. Sometimes I'd see a shoulder pass behind a trunk, then stillness. Once, while I wrestled a blanket corner against a crosswind, I looked down and found Rufus sitting halfway between me and the tree line like a calm little border marker, tail sweeping the grass, eyes bright. "You're no help at all," I told him. "You've picked a side, and it is not mine." He sneezed and kept watch. Lila called that afternoon while I was trimming a frayed rope end on the clothesline. I set the phone on speaker and wedged it against the porch post so I could keep my left hand free. "You sound winded," she said. "You overdoing it again?" "Just line work," I said. How's Owensboro treating you? Busy, loud. I'd trade you some of it if I could. You hear the forecast? Another Blackwater front tonight and tomorrow. They said high gusts at sundown. I looked at the bedding basket waiting by the ringer and did the math wrong on purpose. I'll beat it. Wayne, that shoulder. I know what I can do. She sighed, the sister kind of sigh that carries love and annoyance in the same breath. Then at least tie the wood tarp now, not after supper, and call me if the creek jumps. I will, promise. Eat something besides coffee and stubbornness. That narrows the menu. She laughed. Take care of yourself. When we hung up, I tied the tarp right then, double knot low like Gary taught me, and told myself I'd strip the line early if clouds built fast. Practical plan. Solid plan. By 3 o'clock, the sky had gone from high blue to layered grey, and wind started combing the ridge in long runs that made the pines hiss. I should have left the bedding in the basket. Instead, I fed the ringer one final load, because those sheets had sat too long in a hamper and smelled faintly stale, and Mamma would have washed them before a storm just to spite it. I carried them out heavy and dripping, pinned corners with my left hand and my teeth, and by the time I finished, the line sagged under wet cotton, like a bow under drawer. A little after 5, I was on the porch mending a split clothespin when the weather changed from warning to arrival. Wind dropped in my yard all at once while the trees beyond kept moving, a strange pocket of still around the house, as if the place had taken one held breath. Then I saw the rain wall crossing the far ridge, grey and solid, advancing like drawn curtains. Nope, I said out loud, standing too fast and catching fire in my shoulder. Rufus came up from the steps and pressed against my knee. I grabbed the laundry basket, hurried to the line and started yanking pins one-handed. First sheet came free and wrapped around my face. Second corner slipped. Third, pin shot into the mud. My arm strength faded by the second blanket, and each pull sent a bright streak down my right side. Rain hit the outer pasture in a hard hiss. Come on, I muttered, trying to gather 3 wet folds at once and dropping 2. Then Rufus stopped pacing and sat, not toward me, toward the tree line. I turned, breathing hard, rain spitting cold across my neck, and saw him step into full view at the edge of the yard. Broad chest, dark fur slicking in first droplets, head level, amber-brown eyes steady on me. Even in that weather rush, the first thing I noticed was restraint. He held at the boundary, waiting, like he would not cross without invitation. I swallowed, shifted the basket to my hip, and heard my own voice come out rough but clear. Well, I said, half breathless, half amazed, if you're here to judge my technique, fair enough. He moved then, straight line to the first post, no wasted motion. One hand lifted to the clothesline, and those thick fingers pinched a wooden clip with precision finer than mine on a good day. The clip came free. He folded the sheet once against his forearm, then again, square corners meeting like he'd done laundry all his life. Another clip, another fold. He worked line to line with astonishing care, never jerking fabric, never stepping on trailing hems, placing each folded piece in the porch rocker behind me before taking the next. He kept the stacks separate by size without any sign of hurry. When one gust pushed a pillowcase toward the mud, he caught it mid-air with 2 fingers and laid it on top of the dry pile like glass. I stood there holding one soaked blanket and doing nothing useful while the storm broke open over us. Rain hammered the tin roof, bounced off porch boards, ran down my face and into my shirt. He kept going. Deliberate, exact, kind. At one point he paused, looked to me, and shifted slightly so I could reach the last corner pin without straining my shoulder. I pulled it, handed him the weight of the cloth, and he took it gently, not touching my hand, just relieving the load. That tiny adjustment undid something in me deeper than surprise. He wasn't just helping with a task, he was accommodating my injury. By the time thunder rolled directly overhead, every sheet and blanket sat folded dry on the rocker and porch bench, weighted with smooth stones so the wind couldn't steal them. He turned toward the woodpile tarp next, crossed the yard in 4 long strides, and pressed the loose corner back down, tucking edge under split oak rounds with the flat of his hand, so tight the canvas lay clean as a drum. Then he returned to the porch and set one last top sheet across the rail where I could reach it easily from inside. Rufus sat between us the whole while, rain beading on his coat, calm as Sunday. I realized I was crying only when I tasted salt with rain on my lips. Not loud, not theatrical, just tears spilling because my body had reached the limit of holding. I stood there in the downpour with my bad shoulder throbbing and my mother's hymn stuck in my throat, and this great quiet being met my eyes without flinching. No demand in that look, no claim, just recognition, like he saw the raw, tired part of me I kept hidden behind tasks and numbers and jokes, and answered it with work done carefully. "Thank you," I said, voice breaking on the second word. He held my gaze a moment longer, then dipped his head once, turned, and walked back toward the pines. Not rushed, not dramatic. At the yard edge he paused beside the cedar post, touched the top rail lightly with his knuckles, where Mama used to rest her laundry basket, and stepped into mist and rain until trunks took him in and there was only weather again. I stood on the porch with folded sheets stacked like a promise, one hand on the rail, Rufus leaning warm against my leg, and listened to the storm spend itself against the roof, while the house behind me felt less empty than it had in a very long time. Rain kept striking the roof in hard, even sheets, but I could hear myself over it now, rough breaths pulling in and breaking loose, and once that first crack opened, I couldn't hold anything back. I set the top sheet down on the porch rail with both hands, like I was setting down something fragile, then bent at the waist and put my forehead against the cool wood. My shoulder throbbed all the way into my neck. My chest hurt worse. I cried for my mother in the plain old son way, not tidy, not dignified, not the quiet leaking tears I'd allowed myself in doorways and trucks and shower steam, where nobody could call it what it was. This was different. My ribs shook, my jaw trembled. I was 48 years old, soaked to the skin, and crying into rainwater while a hound leaned his weight into my left leg, like he could brace me against weather and memory both. I had spent months pretending grief could be managed like a repair order. Replace parts, follow sequence, tighten bolts to spec, return system to service. But standing there with folded bedding stacked dry behind me by hands the size of dinner plates, I finally admitted what I'd been fighting. I wasn't fixing anything. I was surviving it one chore at a time and calling that strength. Maybe that was strength, up to a point. Maybe it was also fear. Fear that if I stopped measuring the day, sorrow would swallow me whole. Fear that if I let myself need comfort, nobody would be there to offer it. Then comfort had arrived anyway, quiet and practical, in the shape of saved laundry and weighted corners, and a tarp pulled tight against storm wind. Not a speech, not a miracle show, just care exact and timely. I straightened and wiped my face with my sleeve, then laughed once in that ugly half-sob way that shows your teeth and your heart break at the same time. "You see this, Rufus?" I said, voice unsteady. "I've officially gotten help with housework from the largest gentleman in 3 counties. Rufus sneezed rainwater and wagged, like he'd been trying to explain that for days, and I was finally catching up. I carried the first stack inside in 2 trips, because my arm was done for the evening. The folds were square and true, cleaner than mine. Every edge aligned, no torn seams, no mud splash. Whoever had done this knew cloth, weight, and patience. In the kitchen light, I noticed one clothespin clipped to the top corner of a pillowcase with a shallow, flattened mark pressed into the grain, broad as my thumb joint and then some, a smooth oval where pressure had landed. I unpinned it and rolled it between finger and palm, not as proof for anybody else, just because touching it steadied me. Evidence can be emotional before it is scientific. This little piece of wood said I had not imagined any of it. By the time I got the last blanket over a chair back to finish drying by the stove, thunder had moved east and the rain settled into a lower, steady pour. I remembered my promise and reached for my phone on the counter, hands still shaking enough that I had to dial twice. Lila answered on the second ring. "You okay?" she said immediately. "I was about to call you." "I'm okay," I said. Creaks loud but still inside the banks from what I can tell. Tarp held this time. Laundry almost didn't. "You sound like you've been crying." I leaned a hip against the sink and looked out into the dark yard. "Yeah, I have. Long day." Her voice softened. "I wish I was there." "I know, you are in the ways that count." A pause then. "Did somebody help you? You said almost." I looked at the clothespin in my hand, then at Rufus stretched by the stove with his paws twitching in sleep. "Yeah," I said, careful and true. "Somebody helped me. Right when I needed it." "Well," she said, exhaling slow, "I'm glad you weren't out there alone in that mess." Neither of us spoke for a couple beats. Rain filled the line between us. "Try to sleep," she said. "For real this time." "I'll try. Love you, brother. Love you too." When I set the phone down, the kitchen felt quieter than it had any right to feel after that kind of storm. Not empty, settled. I made tea and didn't drink much of it. I sat at the table where bills were still spread in small, accusing stacks and moved them into a single pile without opening any envelopes. For once, numbers could wait. I took my mother's enamel hymnal from the porch table and brought it inside, laid the goldenrod beside it in a jelly jar, and rested my palm on the cover until my breathing evened out. Then I said out loud, "I miss you every day." And because there was no one to perform for, I added, "I think you'd have understood this better than I do." A little later, with the clock nudging past 9, I stepped back onto the porch with a dry shirt and my old canvas jacket. Rain had thinned to a fine drift. The yard shone black and silver under a break in clouds, and water ran in narrow ribbons down the wheel ruts toward the pasture. Rufus followed, shoulder to my knee, and we stood side by side at the top step. I expected to feel wrung out and hollow. Instead, I felt tender and alert, like my nerves had been sanded down to honest wood. That was when I saw him again, far enough to be a silhouette at first, standing just beyond the cedar post where yard gave way to brush. He wasn't watching for my reaction this time. He was simply there, angled toward the trees, reins sliding off fur in dark lines. One hand hung open at his side, the other lifted once, not waving exactly, more a small turn of the wrist and palm that caught porch light and returned it. A goodbye without ownership, a leave-taking that asked nothing back. I swallowed and stepped down one stair, not closer than that. "You did good work tonight," I said softly. "Thank you for the help. Thank you for all of it." He dipped his head the same way he had before, then turned and moved into the pines with that same deliberate economy, placing each foot where ground would hold, shifting around low branches, respecting the line between my world and his. At the edge of the lower pasture, he paused beside the old sycamore, glancing once toward the porch. Not dramatic, just acknowledgement. Then he continued downslope until tree trunks broke him into shadow and distance took the rest. I stayed where I was, long enough to hear his footfalls fade under runoff and leaves. When even that was gone, I took a flashlight and walked to the yard edge with Rufus at my heel. The beam found prints where mud held shape despite rain, deep and clear, heel to toe longer than my forearm, toes splayed for grip in slick ground. They led away from the clothesline, past the woodpile to the cedar post, then toward the sycamore in a line that never crossed back. No circling, no prowling, just arrival, help, departure. Pattern-matched purpose. I crouched, shoulder complaining, and held the light low to study one track filled halfway with rainwater. I did not cast it. I did not measure it with a tape. I did not call anybody with a badge or a podcast. I simply memorized it and said, "Noted," the way I did under a truck when I found the exact source of a long, stubborn noise. Then I stood and backed away without stepping in any of them, because preserving a trace can be its own kind of respect. Back on the porch, I set the marked clothespin in my mother's old biscuit tin with the crossed stones and feather. Not hidden, not displayed, just kept. I wrote one more note on that invoice pad and stuck it to the fridge. Stormfront arrived 5:12 p.m. Assistants observed at line and woodpile. No harm. Rufus calm throughout. Prince tracked to lower pasture and out. Then I underlined no harm twice because that was the truth at the center of all of it. By full dark, the rain had reduced to roof drips and the creek's far murmur. I turned off the kitchen light and sat in my mother's rocker with a dry sheet over my knees and Rufus asleep at my feet. And I sang one verse of Softly and Tenderly without my voice breaking. Not because pain was gone, but because it finally had company. I stayed in that rocker until the sheet over my knees went warm from my own body heat, and then cool again. And sometime after midnight I woke with my neck bent awkward, and Rufus snoring against my boot. The house was dark except for the stove's low orange seam, and the storm had finally spent itself down to drips from the eaves. I went to bed without turning a light on, carrying that strange, steady calm with me, and for the first night in months, I slept clear through until dawn. Morning came pale and damp. The yard smelled like wet clay and cedar bark, and the air had that rinsed metallic cool that follows hard rain. I fed Rufus, set coffee to perk, and walked straight to the biscuit tin before I did anything else. Stones, feather, clothespin. Still there. I held the pin up to the window again and traced the flattened mark with my thumb, then set it back and closed the lid careful as shutting a watch case. I took my phone, walked to the yard edge, and photographed the remaining prints before the sun softened their edges. Then I measured one against my forearm out of habit, shook my head, and put the tape away. I never sent those photos to any agency. By noon, the shallow ones had already slumped in, and by evening, they were rain-pocked hollows, like the earth had decided to keep its own counsel. At 8:30, I called Lila while she was likely in her kitchen before work. She answered breathless, cabinet doors thumping in the background. "You okay?" she said. "I am," I told her. "Better than okay, actually. I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me finish before you decide I've gone sideways." She went quiet, then said, "All right, I'm listening." I told it plain. Stones on the step. Kindling stacked. Snare opened. Goldenrod by Mama's hymnal. The glimpse by the sycamore. Last night at the line in the storm. I left out nothing that mattered and added no drama where there wasn't any. When I finished, I could hear her breathing and a faucet running at her end. "Wayne," she said softly, "I don't know what to do with half of that." "You don't have to do anything with it." I just needed one person who loves me to hear it exactly as it happened. I believe that you believe it. That's fair. Another pause. Then her voice changed, gentler and firmer at once. I believe you weren't in danger. I can hear that part in you. And I believe something kind met you up there. Even if I can't name it. That was enough, more than enough. Before hanging up, she said, "Don't sell the place because people expect neat explanations." I looked out at the line, empty and bright under the morning sun, and said, "I wasn't planning to." 3 days later, when the mud had firmed and my shoulder gave me a decent window, I drove down to Morrow's for feed and rope. Gary looked up as I came in and gave me a long, measuring look over his glasses, like he was checking whether I'd held together through the weather. "You survived Blackwater?" he asked. "Did," I said. "Barely saved the laundry." He snorted. "That storm stole my tarp and half my temper." I set my items on the counter and leaned in a little. "Gary, you ever hear old stories up this ridge that weren't told as jokes?" He didn't answer right away, just punched a price into the register, then rested both hands on the counter. "My granddad used to say there were ridge keepers," he said. "Said if you minded your place and didn't take more than you needed, sometimes you'd find help done quiet. Firewood, stock gate shut, that sort." I figured he was dressing up memory with age. He met my eyes. "You asking because you found something?" "I found help done quiet," I said. He nodded once, like a man accepting a weight he'd suspected was there. "Then you say thank you and keep your mouth tight around fools. Town'll make a carnival of whatever it can't categorize." That was the closest anyone came to telling me they knew, and he never brought it up again. I respected him for that. The following Monday, I had physical therapy in town and a shoulder review right after. Dr. Hensley ran me through range tests, pushed my arm farther than I liked, watched me grit through it, then made a note. "You're not 100%, he said, "but you're stable for phased return if you stay smart." "I can stay smart," I said. He gave me a dry look that suggested he had met me before. "That would be a new hobby for you. No heroic lifting for 6 weeks." I took the release papers and sat in my truck a long minute before starting it. I had dreaded that appointment for months. Like returning to work meant returning to the man I was before all this. Tight, efficient, closed down. Instead, it felt like one part of life rejoining another. I went straight from there to the shop office, handed Bailey my clearance, and got scheduled for half shifts by Wednesday. Work smelled like solvent and hot metal and old coffee, and for the first hour I thought I might cry over a stripped bolt, because ordinary life had never looked so generous. By the second week of October, I had a new ritual before dawn. Coffee on the porch rail, Rufus at my side. One quiet look to the tree line. Some mornings there'd be nothing at all except mist and the first birds. Some mornings I'd find a small sign, a smooth stone on the lower step, a twig weave tucked into the fence slat. I stopped trying to convert each one into certainty. I didn't need certainty anymore. I needed attention, gratitude, and boundaries kept with respect. I left apples near the cedar post twice a week and a little dry salt in bad weather. If it was gone by night, fine. If not, I collected it at dawn and tried again later. No demand, no bargain. Near the end of October, I took the biscuit tin to the kitchen table and accounted for every kept thing like inventory at shift change. Crossed stones now wrapped in a dish towel so they wouldn't chip. Barred feather pressed between wax paper in Mama's hymnal. Clothespin with the broad thumb mark in a small jar by itself. Invoice notes from each encounter, copied into a spiral notebook with dates, weather, and what Rufus did. Print photos backed up on a flash drive labeled Ridge, locked in my toolbox. I did not submit any of it for analysis. That was a deliberate choice. noted in the notebook. Evidence retained privately, not for proving, for remembering. Lila came up the first Saturday in November with a casserole, and the practical expression she wears when she's prepared to disagree, lovingly. We stood on the porch while Rufus leaned against both of us in turns, shameless about his priorities. She touched the rail where the folded top sheet had sat weeks before. "Show me where." I walked her line to line, post to post, through the yard edge and down toward the sycamore. I pointed out where the snare had been opened and where the prints had led out. No tracks remained by then, only settled mud and leaf fall. She listened without interrupting, hands in jacket pockets, eyes moving between my face and the trees. At the porch again, she said, "I still can't explain it." "I can't either." She looked at me a long second, then smiled in that tired sister way that carries history and truce at once. "You look like yourself again, not the shut-down version, the real one." We ate casserole at the kitchen table with Mama's hymnal between us and the goldenrod petals pressed flat inside. Before leaving, Lila stood at the door and said, "Keep singing out here, she'd like that." I told her I would. Winter came early in little rehearsals. First frost silvering the pasture, then hard mornings where the pump handle stung your palm. I kept working at the shop, came home to the ridge, and did my chores slower but steadier. When I found old wire set wrong near the lower fence, I removed it. When I checked the property line, I carried cutters and took out 2 more neglected snares from years back. I stopped treating kindness as a rare event and started practicing it as routine. That was the real shift, I think. Wonder did not make me less practical. It made my practicality less armored. The last clear sign came in January after a night of dry cold and stars sharp as tacks. I opened the door at dawn and found 4 split cedar sticks leaned against the post by size, smallest to largest, with 1 red oak chip set on top like a capstone. Nothing else. No tracks in the crusted ground I could read. I laughed under my breath and said, "Message received. Keep the fire fed." Then I carried those sticks inside and lit the stove with them, and the house warmed quick. I never saw him full in the yard again after the storm night. That is also part of the truth. There were evenings when the wind held and Rufus sat facing the pines with that calm, listening posture. And I'd catch the cedar animal scent for a moment, then lose it. There were mornings with 1 stone on the step and mornings with none. Whatever knew me on that ridge stayed wild and withheld and kind. That was enough. Maybe it was always meant to be enough. By March, my shoulder could take a full shift without barking, and I signed the final return paperwork at Bailey's office with my right hand, shaky but usable. On the drive home, I passed the turnoff to my old rental in town and didn't even slow down. I came up the ridge instead, fed Rufus, hung a load of sheets facing the pines, and sang all 3 verses of Softly and Tenderly while pinning corners square. My voice was still rough. It held. I carry that night with me the way I carry a good wrench. Used, trusted, not shown off. The world did not get smaller again after it. My grief for Mama stayed, but it quit being a closed room. It became a porch with weather moving through and room for another chair. I kept the house. I kept the rituals. I kept the tin with stones and feather and marked clothespin, and I kept my mouth mostly shut except with people I trust to listen without making a spectacle. When storms stack over Blackwater now, I tie the tarp low, double knot, and leave 1 apple by the cedar post before dark. Then I go inside, put water on for tea, and live in a world I know for certain is larger and kinder than I used to allow.